This is Duke University.
I would like to say that as a professor of English, I have been now working, shifting somewhat into new territory and into history. I've never, not in graduate school, not subsequent to that, ever encountered any mentor who gave of themselves, made themselves available in as gracious a manner, as generous a manner as Dr. Franklin. I just cannot describe the extent of his graciousness. When I left after my 5 weeks, Dr. Franklin said, well, Lea, if you have any questions, there's always a telephone. And I did avail myself. So I'm going to be asking Dr. Franklin several questions, and after that, there are a couple of issues we will probably talk about. And I hope I'll have time to say a couple of words about his book and also about the archives themselves. And I felt that probably the issue of greatest interest to everyone here might indeed be, Dr. Franklin, what brought about your interest in Williams?
Thank you, Lea. Let me say first of all that I am so delighted that through Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness, Lea Fridman became interested in George Washington Williams. He's been resurrected to some extent by me, but now she has resurrected not only Williams, but me and Williams. And I have thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity I've had to refresh myself in this subject. I became interested in George Washington Williams many years ago. I'd never heard of him until I had claimed the attention of some New York publishers who were interested in my writing a history of African Americans. I didn't have any plans to write a history of African Americans, ever. I certainly didn't at that point. I simply wrote them back that I had so much on my plate that there was no need of discussing this, of whether I should write a history of African Americans, because I'd never get to it. They worked on me. This is Alfred Knopf and his cohorts in New York. And they asked me finally to come to New York, and they had a contract they'd like me to sign. Well, I looked at the contract, and it was very exciting, very attractive, because it offered me an advance. Before I'd written a line, they offered me an advance. And I thought this was very flattering, very flattering. Especially since the advance was of the munificent sum of $250. And so that persuaded me that I had to do it. And then after I signed the contract, and I was working, teaching at North Carolina College for Negroes in Durham, now North Carolina Central University. And I began to trying to decide where I should start. Well, I knew of Dr. Carter Woodson's The Negro in Our History. It was not very exciting, not very attractive from my point of view, and not a good model for anything I wanted to do. And so I began to look around for other possible models, not knowing that there weren't hardly any other histories of African Americans at all. But I did, in reading the stacks down at North Carolina College for Negroes, one day I came across a book called The History of the Negro Race in America by George Washington Williams. I said, what is this? Not one volume, 2 volumes. Published in 1888. 2 volumes by George Washington Williams, of whom I'd never heard. And I pulled it down and looked at it, and it looked pretty good. You know, chapters well organized, long bibliography, all the other trappings of scholarship that one could think of. And so I decided that this was something of a model. When I was in Washington a little later, I went by Dr. Woodson's office. We had become friends over the years. Well, I was quite young at the time, and so it's not too many years, but we had become friends. And so I asked him, I said, Dr. Woodson, who is this man Williams, George Washington Williams? And he said, well, he's a very eminent historian. I said, what else did he write besides this history of the Negro race? He said he wrote the history of the Negro troops in the Civil War. Very good. I said, oh, well, and he began to tell me other things that Williams had done. I said, why is he such a deep, dark secret? He said, well, and he began to explain to me the problem of scholarship among African Americans and the difficulty of moving out into the larger stream of American scholarship, and that people just didn't pay any attention to what African Americans wrote. And so that's where Williams was, sunk into the mire of yesterday and never recovered. Well, that was in a sense an encouragement to me that I might follow in his footsteps and be worthy of association, my name and his, as the legacy of the African American people in the field of history. And so not only did I sign the contract with Alfred Comp, but I began to work diligently, inspired as I was by Williams. Dr. Woodson had said, if you are really interested in him, he said, why don't you write a paper and I'll put you on the program at the next meeting of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. I said, well, that's an inspiration. And I proceeded to do it. And he proceeded to not only put me on the program, but to schedule my great definitive piece on Williams for the next issue of the Journal of Negro History. So, you know, I'm going pretty fast by this time. Publication of someone that was a few weeks earlier quite obscure. And that was the beginning. And from that point until this day, Williams has occupied a fairly considerable amount of attention in my life. And I'm deeply grateful because his life is an inspiration. And in a very special way, because he was so professional himself. And he set standards. He was a man who not only had not been to graduate school, he'd not been to college or anything like that, who set standards that were so high that I, who had been to college, been to graduate school, so forth, that I had a hard time meeting these standards. And so that's how I became interested in Williams, and I still am.
And what about that life and William's story and his key accomplishments? Could you?
Well, Williams was a man born in western Pennsylvania, and he was not a slave, although he was born in 1849. He was not a slave. Slavery was outlawed in Pennsylvania, although plantation owners brought their slaves with them as they visited New York and Philadelphia and even western Pennsylvania. They brought their slaves. And there were some abolitionists who wanted to challenge their effort, their bringing the slaves into free territory, as it were. But they didn't bother Williams. Williams never was challenged, so far as I know, as a possible runaway slave or anything like that. But his career was defined by the fact that there was no slavery in Pennsylvania, and very little slavery anywhere he traveled in the northern part of the United States. But there was the pall of slavery sort of hanging over him wherever he went and whatever he did. And so he had to be careful about his movements, his activities, and so forth. But in the face of that, what he did was most remarkable. He was enlisted in the Civil War and fought in many of the major battles of the war, and became a kind of hero to people that knew him, and became at the end one of the celebrated veterans. By which time he was interested in doing something about himself. And so he began to look around for opportunities for education. He learned about a university that had been established for blacks in Washington, D.C., called Howard University. And he wrote to Mr. Howard, Oliver Otis Howard, who was the namesake of the university was named for him, and he was one of the officials at the university. So Williams, this is so typical of him, it would be so typical of him in the future years, went to the top. Why do you bother about anyone who's not running the place, whose name's not attached to it? So he wrote to Oliver Otis Howard, and in a letter which is so poorly written and so broken that I'm still working on trying to understand what he was meaning. But it was enough to Howard and to the others that he wanted to come to this place. And so Oliver Howard, endorsing the letter, said, "Admit if qualified." Well, he wasn't qualified, but he was admitted. And he stayed there for a short while, much less than a year. But he didn't like Howard, and it was going too slowly for him, and he was all dressed up and nowhere to go. And so he dropped out and began to see if he could find an institution that met his needs and that would facilitate his becoming a major figure. He always wanted to be that. And so he learned of a place in Massachusetts called, what's the name of it?
Newton Theological.
Newton Theological seminary or institution it was then. And he applied there, and they turned him down. And he didn't let that stop him. He went up there and asked for some special opportunity. And they admitted him to what they called the it was a kind of probation, and he went into that, and that was Newton's Theological Seminary's mistake, because he went in there and got himself situated, and then he proceeded to leave the class. Mm-hmm. And graduated. He was admitted to the English course, which is a remedial program. He got to Newton, went through that remedial program in short order, and joined the regular program, and then was the leader of his class. So when the class of 1874 graduated, Williams, who was supposed to be still learning English or something in a very limited fashion at Newton Theological Institute, Williams was graduating, not merely graduating, but the head of his class, and gave the student oration at commencement time, and was on his way to an extraordinary career. He's by this time in his 20s, and he's becomes the pastor of the leading Baptist church in Boston, leading Baptist church for blacks in Boston. And there's no stopping him now. Go ahead.
And from there, he goes on to become the first legislator of the state of Ohio eventually, writes the two major histories, all kinds of other things, including dramatist and novelist, the first black journalist for a white newspaper, the Cincinnati Commercial. And
Columns, he was a columnist.
Right. And at some point also is asked to be the minister to Haiti. That's a whole issue of the United States, and eventually goes up the Congo River the very same year as Joseph Conrad and publishes the very first alert to the world of the extraordinary murderous regime of Leopold, which would take 10 million lives by 1908, and he does this in 1890. What were the particular challenges of writing this biography?
Well, first challenge was there was no record, no papers. You know, when you write someone's biography, you expect to go to see I'm going to do a biography of Ernestine Friedel. And so they said, well, we've got the Friedel papers. They aren't very large. We've only got 5 cases of them. But you can supplement that with other things. There wasn't one sheet of paper of George Washington Williams except this letter to General Oliver Otis Howard that he wanted to go to. And that's what Howard University had. That's the only piece of paper they had with his name on it. And they sent it to me, and I began to build up a Williams bibliography from that paper, that sheet of paper. And it took a great deal of grubbing and struggling, going through records and finding one by one some evidence of his activity, and by gradually putting together this material, I was able to reconstruct his life. I went back to the census. I got the information from Western Pennsylvania about his early life. And then I got into the records of the United States Army and was able to build up his Army career, including his court-martial. I don't know for what, but he got shot through the left lung and as the record says, as the court-martial record says, not in the line of duty. I never discovered what line he was guilty of, but he was shot not in the line of duty. And but I was able to build up a record from the Ministry of the United States Army. And then after he got to after he got to Newton, then he passes the 12th Baptist Church in Boston. And there's a record of him there. And then he goes to Cincinnati to be the pastor of a church there, and that's on the record. And then when he stopped that and was elected to the legislature, the state legislature in Ohio, that's a part of the record. So I'm collecting now. I'm building up what is now the Williams Collection, which is here at Duke University. All the information about him as a student, as a young preacher, and as a senior person and minister, and as he becomes active in other fields. For example, he runs for the legislature in Ohio, and he's elected from Cincinnati. And then he gets the opportunity to be a newspaper editor, contributor, columnist in Cincinnati. And so he writes for the Cincinnati Commercial. And from there, he moves on. And I'm gathering all the time all these papers. And I can say this, that they began to come to me with such ease that I became preoccupied not so much with his life, but with collecting the papers. You see the distinction there. You can get so involved in a process that you forget what the goal is, or you overlook what the goal is. But what else do you want but to have Williams papers? Well, I've settled that. I've answered the question. Is that Franklin, get back on track and see if you can't use these papers to some constructive good in reconstructing the life of this extraordinary man. And so I did. And so all of the papers regarding his appointment, as Lea referred to his appointment, as the United States Minister to Haiti. Now, it's important that we find out about that. It's important we get the papers. But the papers are not the end. It's what happens to Williams in his struggle to become the United States minister. And he fails because he is, despite the fact that he was not only appointed, but confirmed by the Senate. The Secretary of State would not issue a certification of his qualifications, and therefore he'd had no credentials to present to the Haitian government, and therefore he never really served. So this is a very interesting indication of the difference between trying to make an evaluation on the one hand of his becoming minister to Haiti, And on the other hand, well, his evaluation of his qualifications or his papers. So I had to be careful and consistent in my effort to make certain that I had my eye on what he was trying to do, and not just what I was trying to do. I was trying to get his papers, and that was a session with me, and so I had to be careful that somehow I use these papers to reconstruct his life. But that's what I was up to.
I think that it's important because Dr. Franklin's book, in some sense, it's quite dense, but there's a great modesty about the book itself, and I think it's often lost that it required the collection of documents on 3 continents and pursuit of Williams for stretching over 40 years to put that together. And I think it is just an extraordinary triumph. And actually, I've gone through it several times. And I'm a literary person, you know, so I'm used to, let's say, reading Proust several times, or, you know, or Wallace Stevens or something like that. I have never done that with it, with any other kind of work, certainly not history. But every time I've gone through this, there was great enlightenment, and I suddenly began to understand not only the significance of the pursuit, a very relentless pursuit of what is the fact. And Professor Franklin's book is incredibly judicious. He lays out before you, rather than just giving you one big narrative, he lays out before you various documents conflicting with one another, and then reasons it out to you so that he actually establishes around this particular figure around whom there's been a lot of dissension, there are a lot of lies that had been circulating about him, but he creates a rock-solid case. In any case, I just, the achievement of that biography, particularly in the light of the fact that Williams, who is more famous than famous in his life, every time he goes to lunch, it's written up in the newspapers. Every time he speaks, it's written up in the newspaper. If he's planning a new book, it's written up in the newspaper. And yet, once he dies, he's totally forgotten. Although he alerts the world to what Leopold is doing, the Congo Reform Movement, which takes off about 12 years later, they totally forget about him. His materials are eyewitness documentation, and yet they totally forget about him. And in the light of that, and I think in the light of my next question, which has to do with Williams and his place in African American historiography, I think that this book is just a landmark. And as I said, I think in the most modest way. It's deceptive in a sense. But
well, I think that it's well to remember that what I was trying to do was to reconstruct a life, and I found that was extraordinarily difficult. Here's a person who is just a name. In 1945, he's just a name. That's all he is. One piece had been written on him for the first edition of the Dictionary of American Biography, and it is very short, but very long on misinformation. Mm-hmm. So that it provides no lead whatever. And then the other information, bit by bit, that I collected, I tried to salt it down, so to speak, to use an agricultural term when you're working with cattle. Salt it down, so to speak, so that if there's nothing else to put with it, at least that will be preserved. So what I did was to write a number of articles as I proceeded. Maybe this is the last time I get a chance to write anything about it, but it never was quite the last time. And I had to make certain that I put the next nugget in place. So the bibliography of Williams is fairly long. Not necessarily because he deserved a big bibliography or anything, but because of the way I was collecting the material and preserving it. That's what I was doing, collecting it and preserving it over the years. So if finally I thought I should write up Williams as a journalist, or Williams as a historian, or Williams as a whatever, to make certain that posterity would understand who he was and what he was, and never realizing that in the end he might be a whole person. And yet by the time I I followed him everywhere I could, everywhere he was. That's a whole another story. But by the time I got to Kinshasa in the Congo, I realized that I had a full-grown man on my hands, a man who had a life that was somewhat complete, for it was on that trip that he made his last moves. He not only went to Kinshasa and traced Williams as Williams went up the Congo River, but he stopped and evaluated Williams's work all through that period. And then he goes on his own around the Cape and up the Indian Ocean and finally to the Canary Islands and into the Mediterranean. And it's there that he boards a ship that will take him to England. And it was on that ship that he met Alice Fryer, an English woman who had been a governess for an English family in India, and she was returning to England. And so he got a ride on the same boat with her, and he spent those moonlit evenings on the Mediterranean with her. And by the time they got to England, they were engaged. You heard Lea say that he had a wife back home, but apparently I haven't been able to find the papers of divorce or separation, but apparently it did happen at some point that they were officially separated and divorced, but I have not found it. And but he became enamored of Alice Fryer on this ship, so that by the time they got to England, they were irrevocably tied together. And but he had not been well. He had suffered from various lung infections, and one supposed he had tuberculosis. But by the time they got to London and began to pal around together in London, he got sick, really sick, to the point that she decided to take him up the west coast of England for the sea air. Now, and if you've spent any time in England, you know that sea air will kill you. And the British call it so invigorating and so forth, but it has the in it that will really bring you down. So then by the time she got to Blackpool with Williams, he was ill, gravely ill. And so she got a room for him in the hotel, and she stayed there. They got medical attention, but he continued to go down, and he, on the 2nd of August, 1891, he died. He died in England, in Blackpool. And she had to bury him and inventory the material for the United States government and to notify people in the United States. She was prostrate for 3 days, it said, and his life was reviewed and criticized and reviewed, and sometimes praised, but not often. And he becomes a figure, a kind of legend as we go down through the years, especially when some of this information about him is shorn from his principal character, and therefore you don't know when you're finding the truth and when you're not finding it. And the Williams, the true Williams, has to be re-examined entirely. But let me close just by saying that my wife and I were in London for some purpose, and I woke up one morning and I said, you know, Williams has to be here. I said, he didn't go anywhere. He's in England. She said, well, where would he be? I said, be in Blackpool. She said, well, why don't we go to Blackpool to see him, to see what's going on? So we decided to go to Blackpool. And it was in Blackpool that I ran into the morning I got there. We went up on a night train. We got to Blackpool early that morning, and although I didn't sleep all that much on it, I was absolutely awake and alert and anxious to go. And so I was down at City Hall early that morning, and I didn't look like I belonged in City Hall at 8 o'clock in the morning, but I was there. So people got curious what I was doing there at that time of morning. And I explained to one or two of the people that I was looking for some sign of Williams, and I was trying to find out about it before people got busy with their own business at City Hall and places like that. And so these one or two people got interested in what I was interested in. And by 10 o'clock, I had a lot of people who were waiting for me to get information from the office that had charge of burials and so forth. So we found whether Williams was really buried. So when the warden of the cemetery arrived, I was first on his list because I'd been there. And I told him what I wanted. I said to him, you have a Williams in your cemetery. And he said, well, just as soon as I can get these people buried, have to bury today, he said, I'll look you up. The warden of the cemetery in England, if you If not, if you haven't been hanging around the cemetery, you might not know this. The warden is on the day of a funeral, on the time of a funeral. He runs the show like our undertakers do here. He runs the show. He has his morning coat on, his long swallowtail coat, and has his white stiff shirt and tie and whatnot. And so I asked him, did he have a Williams? And he said, yes, I have a Williams. And I said, is George W.? He said, yes, I have a George W. I said, the one I have died on the 2nd of August, 1891. I said, that's my man. And so I was talking, first, let me revise, I was talking to him about telephone. And then I went out there and saw him, and he recounted that that's what, that was, I had the right information. And my wife said, are you going to go out there? You want us to go to the grave? I said, yes. She said, well, we should get flowers. And I said, well, all right, we'll get flowers. And some people were standing around and said, can we go with you? I said, sure. Come all of you if you want. And we finally got up a little procession, and with the warden of the cemetery leading the procession, we went down to grave F, number 10 or whatever it was. And it was a very nice, quiet, dignified funeral procession, somewhat belated, but we went. This is 81, and he had died in 1891. And so we took flowers, we laid it on the tomb, and we paid our respects, and I ordered a tombstone, and it came later, and it was put on his grave, and he rested in peace from 1891 to the present time. Although we could do it, we could officially claim him and say he rested in peace certainly from 1981 to the present time. I lived with him then more than 40 years, and he became a real figure in my life. He became something of an obsession, and although it's in a sense a great joy to reconstruct the life of a person, you have to be careful, otherwise he will take you in and you won't have a life of your own. But it was great delight. And now that Lea Fridman is doing a story on him for a play which she plans to write in her own area, I think Williams will be living a little longer, and that's a great pleasure.
I just want to add a couple of things. One is that the interesting thing about the open letter that I find pretty extraordinary, and I think I'm eager to have more scholars in a variety of disciplines deal with that open letter, is that Williams, who writes it, by the way, after Leopold specifically in a personal meeting told him, don't go there. So Williams, this son of a freed black slave, defies this king and is in fact probably writes the first indictment of a European monarch ever. When he writes this up, he's a trained lawyer, and he writes it up in an interesting form. He writes it up as a series of charges. He doesn't write up a story, a history, the way 8 years later Zola did with another open letter. His open letter, the Zola, becomes very famous. William's open letter does not, but William's letter is very different. He sets it up legally. It's a series of charges, and then he grounds his series of charges in legal statute. He said, I'm grounding this, I base my appeal, the appeal, by the way, is to, first and foremost, humanity, and then commerce, and then some other things. But, so it's grounded in values that pertain to all people. And he says that he's appealing to the mass of people. So he's kind of thinking about people as just people, not people as they belong to specific states. He sets up these charges. He grounds it in the Act of Berlin, Article 35, Chapter such and such, and calls for an investigation into Leopold's crimes that he had elaborated at great length in those 12 articles, in those 12 charges. And so, in a sense, what I find extraordinary, is this, I use the word chutzpah. The kid, 14 years old, he has the chutzpah to go and fight with the Union Army, even if he has to go under an alias, change his name. Later on, he becomes this extraordinary historian who challenges the entire academy, which has been really writing the white history of America, and he's rewriting the history of America. So he challenges the story of America and the writing of the story of America. And here he challenges a king and challenges a world to recognize crimes against humanity, to formalize a system of international jurisprudence that will hold rulers accountable to the rule of a higher law. It just seems to me this man is unreal. I'm going to read something that Dr. Franklin wrote. His archive is a treasure. He's got his unpublished essays, unpublished materials of all kinds by Williams. It's just extraordinary. This is Dr. Franklin. The white academic community was silent, and none of the scientific histories took notice of either the works by Williams, so far as I'm able to discover. They did not review his works, and they did not include them in their numerous critical biographies that they prepared in the closing years of the 19th century. But Williams had created a field of historical study where his white counterparts had not. Single-handedly and without the blessing or approval of the academic community, Williams called attention to the importance of including African Americans in any acceptable history of the nation long before the historian of various groups of European Americans or Asian Americans had begun to advocate similar treatment for their groups. It is not too much to say that George Washington Williams was responsible for the beginnings of African American historiography. I have to say that I certainly understand why Professor Franklin, I keep on calling him Professor Williams. The last day I've been doing that. I've had these slips. Why Professor Franklin has said in his autobiography and elsewhere that he identified with Williams and has been obsessed with Williams. Williams is just one of those glories you've spoken about of the journey of African American life here. Are there questions?
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.